Hello everyone. We're going to be doing something a little bit different in this episode. Rather than news or an analysis of current events, we're going to be taking a little bit of a deeper dive into a specific topic. We're going to be looking at the Russian political theorist and philosopher Aleksandr Dugin. Now, those who have been following this show for a while may remember we talked a little while ago about the assassination of Dugin's daughter, and there are a few words that I would like to say about that before we move on. Now, there is reason to believe at this point, although it's hard to say for certain, that Dugin's daughter was killed by the Ukrainian intelligence services. Now, she was a lot of things, including a propagandist, and the same thing could be said about Dugin, who was most likely the target of the attack. But neither of them were military targets. Considering this, if she was killed by Ukrainian intelligence, that would constitute a terror attack. And I do think it's important to be clear on that. If they did kill her, it was a bad decision, and it was wrong. This does not change the fact that Russia is fighting an offensive war, has committed numerous war crimes, and just recently launched a campaign of terror bombings against major Ukrainian cities. Ukraine is not a perfect victim, and it is not a perfect country, and although it's a natural temptation, it is silly and unhelpful to see it as such. Ukraine has many other problems, and I hope that they will be resolved, but their biggest problem right now by far is the hostile army occupying large portions of the country. Now, with that out of the way, people who have been watching Russia since before the war might remember a lot of articles talking about Dugin as Putin's brain and portraying him as a guiding ideologue for the current government. So before we look at the reasoning and thinking behind this idea, let's start with answering the question of, is it true? And the answer flatly is no, it is not. Aleksandr Dugin is a vehement supporter of Putin the symbol as the redeemer and leader of Russia. But reading his recent writings, it becomes increasingly clear that he is not a supporter of Putin the president. Now, in an interview back in 2017, Dugin said about Putin, "We demand from him to be much more authoritarian than he is," going on to add that, quote, "he a little bit disappoints us." During a debate with Bernard-Henri Lévy in 2019, Dugin said, "That was the mistake, that we have only taken Crimea or only Donbass. It was a mistake and we should restore and reconstruct Ukraine." Since the beginning of the war, Dugin has turned to a lot more explicit and aggressive criticism, ending a recent article with, "Let the old regime bury its dead, a new Russian time is coming, relentlessly." So Dugin is not the guiding force behind Putin. If he was, we would have seen a full Russian invasion in 2014, and right now Russia would be on a full, total war footing, and would be fully politically mobilized, which despite the military mobilization, Russia is not politically mobilized right now, and Putin will not allow it to become so, except as a last resort. So if Dugin is not a supporter of the Russian government, why do they fund his think tanks? Why is he allowed on state television while being critical, and very openly critical, of the government? Well, first of all, before the war, he was not a threatening figure to Putin or to the Russian state. Secondly, Dugin is an extremist. He makes Putin look moderate. Both Westerners and Russian liberals can look at him and say, well, Putin is bad, but at least he's not as bad as this Dugin guy. Now, Dugin has been taking on this role recently, but in the past, the Russian government has had other figures like this. Before Dugin, the most famous figure of this sort was Vladimir Zhirinovsky, the founder and former leader of the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia. And I'd like to take a moment to recommend the interview Aleksandr Dugin, Russian Scarecrow, with Andreas Umland, which can be found on neweasterneurope.eu. So I want to end off by saying that yes, Putin has ideas, he has things he believes in, and these beliefs definitely do guide his actions. But that doesn't mean that we can find a single guide or philosopher or intellectual inspiration for him that will explain what he believes, and a lot of attempts are made in this direction with Dugin, but there are also other figures who are suggested sometimes, commonly Ivan Ilyin. Now, just because there are overlaps in his beliefs and the beliefs of these figures, and even if he endorses some of them publicly, does not mean that they are guiding his foreign policy. Putin's beliefs could be better explained by looking at them as a mix of Soviet nostalgia, Russian nationalism and imperialism, and the idea of a clash of civilizations, mixed with a suspicion of the main enemy of NATO from his time in the KGB. Putin does not have a coherent set of ideas and beliefs that guide him, But that doesn't mean that he doesn't have an ideology. Just because his ideas are a mishmash and cannot be traced back to just one intellectual or thinker does not mean that they do not guide his beliefs. And understanding what is happening in Ukraine right now does depend on understanding what Putin believes and the importance of those beliefs in driving his decision-making. But the source of those ideas is not Aleksandr Dugin, and his importance in Western media has been extremely exaggerated. This has been a look at Aleksandr Dugin and his importance and influence on Putin, and thank you for listening.